Bom dia a todos, tá? Meu nome é Marco Antônio Alves, eu sou coordenador de comunicação da Eletronuclear e é com muito prazer que a gente está mediando esse painel aqui. Mas antes da gente começar, eu gostaria de fazer uns pequenos avisos a todos, né? A nossa sessão vai ser em inglês e nós temos um serviço de tradução simultânea disponível. Ele está disponível na barra de ferramentas do Zoom. Tem um botão que tem um ícone de um globo, tá? É só a gente clicar ali e selecionar o idioma entre inglês e português, o que vocês preferem ouvir. Clicando nele, automaticamente entra no idioma.
When you click on the globe, it will automatically place you in one or the other language. The questions to the panelists will be made through the chat, also available on the bottom of the screen. I ask you all to make your questions there, and we will select the questions at the end of each speaker's speech. Today we have two speakers from World Nuclear Association, Mr. David Hess and Mr. Jontahan Cobb. Each one of them will have 40 minutes. After that, we will have a Q&A session about the presentations. After that, we will have the second presentation and another Q&A session. I hope everyone has a good event. And now I will hand the floor over. I will start speaking in English to present our speakers. And if you need, you can use the simultaneous interpretation. Thank you all. Have a good event.
Everybody, please be welcome. And this event, okay, I would like to introduce you to our guest speakers, Mr. David Hess and Mr. Jontahan Cobb from World Nuclear Association. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for being with us today. And I would also like to thank WNU and ABDAN for the opportunity to present this panel. Communication, nuclear energy, is a very sensitive topic in nuclear and industry, and especially in Brazil, but it is the same in the whole world. No one has a magic formula for dealing with it. Okay, and it's very important for us in Brazil to learn from other experiences. I hope we can have a good experience today, and I will call Mr. Dave Hess to be our first speaker. Yeah, David Hess is a policy analyst at the World Nuclear Association and part of the Harmony program, where he works to help the nuclear industry meet the challenge of providing 25% of global electricity by 2050. Okay. One part science communicator, one part industry analyst, and one part evidence-based policy advocate. David's main focus areas include nuclear technology, economics, climate change, sustainable development, and now increasingly space exploration. Okay, now I will hand you over Mr. Hess. Good afternoon, Mr. Hess.
Greetings everybody, and thank you, Marco, for that introduction. So I am really struck by something that Marco said, which was that there is no magic formula for communication. And I hope that as I go through my presentation, that will become like very obvious. I would also like to point out that while I sort of focus on policy now, I've spent a lot of time working in communications too, and that was kind of my my jump-in point, really. And it was a very interesting time. I'm still actively communicating because I think in our roles that we all are, but certainly have managed to gain a fair bit of experience on communicating nuclear issues, which I hope will be useful to you today. So I'm just going to try and set things up now. Give me 1 second. Okay. Yep, it's just loading. So once again, thank you to Marco for the introduction. I think he covered that quite well. Moving on. Okay. Right. Okay. I think it's very important that we have a signpost of where we're going. So that's the point of this slide here. But today I'm going to cover some of the basics. I hope that's all right. But I think it's very important to go over what communication is and how it can go wrong when we look at how we should be communicating about nuclear. So always important to start from the beginning and sort of build up from there. I'm going to proceed through a discussion of strategic communications or corporate communications, I guess, which I think is perhaps maybe poorly understood because it's actually quite a rich area, and inside any kind of corporation or organization, there's a lot of communication roles you can end up filling. Then we're going to progress to the really good stuff, onto the nuclear communication challenges and opportunities, and hopefully there I might give you a slightly different perspective to what you think nuclear communication should be about. If you already know all this stuff, then that's great. And I'd be really interested to hear feedback and questions on that section in particular. And then for the last section, we're going to just provide some useful communication resources and places where you can go if you are actively communicating nuclear, looking for some help in doing so, or perhaps even looking at submitting your own knowledge on the subject. Okay, and without further ado, on to the first section. We are natural communicators. I think it's really important to realize that amongst all animals, humans really sort of own this label. We communicate all of the time. We often communicate even when we don't intend to communicate. And so, or even sometimes when we're not trying to communicate at all. So when we say nothing, that can be interpreted as information. And of course, we communicate in so many different ways. So here's a picture of my niece, actually, not on the left, but on the right of screen. And she's showing us how it's possible to communicate visually. Of course, you can communicate verbally at conferences. Here is the old WNA Director General, Agneta Riesing, talking to the head of the UAE's nuclear program. And of course, increasingly now we communicate digitally as well. So we communicate for personal reasons, we communicate professionally, and we communicate socially. So what is communication? Well, I mean, we all do it. So we all have an instinctive understanding. Defining it is a little tricky. It's at its very essence, just the exchange of information. And this can be done via different mediums, speaking, writing, or using some other forms. The main types are verbal communication, so using language, through speaking or through sign language. Non-verbal communication, of course, is incredibly important in our social interactions and consists of body languages, gestures, facial expressions, etc. We can even communicate with inarticulate noises and grunts quite effectively if we need to. Then, of course, there's written communication and visual communication. And just an early question to consider is, can you think of any others? So I think it's worth having a look at some of the basic models of communication to understand what's involved in the process. And this was an early model that was put together. It's a simple one, and it's sort of captures 5 distinct parts of the communication process. So there's a sender, an encoder, so the process of turning information into a message. And then that message is communicated across some kind of channel before it is then decoded on the other side by a receiver who communicates back that they've understood the message they received via some kind of feedback process. Now, this model was very much designed with the ideas of messages which were delivered across wire networks, radio perhaps, and there was this idea that there could be noise, like some kind of signal noise that would interfere with communication that would happen at the channel. But I think that as when you think about communication sort of more deeply, you realize that in fact, noise or the ability to miscommunicate can occur pretty much at any level in the communication process. So you might make a mistake in encoding the message. Equally, your decoding machine might not work correctly and some kind of errors get into the process that way. Inside the sender itself, maybe they're emotionally upset, not functioning at 100%, and the message that they mean to communicate comes out garbled. And similarly, the person receiving the message might be distracted and the message gets lost there. So this idea of transmitting a message or transmitting information has many places where it can in fact fail. And I just, when you think of the challenges that nuclear is facing now, you know, when you have a communication that backfires or is not understood correctly, then this causes big problems. So remembering to keep in mind that communication isn't always simple. In fact, in some ways, it's a miracle that it works at all. And focusing on the things which can go wrong is very important. Another model, this one is more complicated. The same basics are there. So A is trying to communicate to B, but C is what is called the gatekeeper. And you can see this working or being more relevant to situations, for example, of mass media communication, where the gatekeeper is a journalist or a news article or news outlet or something like that. The other important aspect of this model is that we don't communicate in a vacuum, right? So there's always some kind of context, and the different people in the communication chain or process have access to different contextual factors which they take on board in communicating or in passing on that message to a wider audience. So that's the X1, 2, 3, 4 to N that you see on the side there. And once again, of course, there is feedback. So there's feedback going from both the gatekeeper, but also from the intended receiver back to the communicator to let them know that they understood the message and what they think about it. Okay, so I think it is very important
Então, eu acho que é muito importante perceber os elementos ricos e diversos que acontecem na comunicação, principalmente dentro da indústria nuclear. A minha experiência hoje é que a gente fica muito obcecado com a mensagem. E eu acho que isso acontece em toda a comunicação corporativa. Todo mundo fala da importância de passar a mensagem e como isso vai ter uma influência grande. Às vezes você se encontra em lugares em que as pessoas ficam horas debatendo qual vai ser a mensagem, quais vão ser as palavras exatas, porque elas vão ter um poder mágico de influência. Mas às vezes eles esquecem ou negligenciam outros aspectos importantes da comunicação. Então, a primeira coisa a se fazer é tratar da linguagem, da mensagem, mas e o conteúdo emocional? E o tom? Então, é positivo, é animado, é responsável? Isso não está só na mensagem, nas palavras que você escolhe, mas também na forma de entrega na mensagem, no tom da sua voz. E também tem a empatia.
Você está tentando se conectar com o seu público? Você está facilitando para eles se envolverem, entender o processo? E tem mais coisas além disso. Tem a parte seca da descrição, ou você tá usando metáforas também? Para fazer comunicações mais importantes o possível.
And it seems obvious because we are natural communicators, humans are natural communicators, but when you get to the corporate environment, sometimes these other aspects can get lost, and you don't want that, not in my opinion. Okay, so just a few slides to review where we're at. First of all, humans are communication animals. Almost anything we can do can transmit information, and sometimes the things we don't do. We use communication to share information, to ask questions, to express wants and needs, to develop our relationships and maintain social etiquette. So it is very much integral to our day-to-day lives. But it's a complex process. It can go wrong, it can go right, and hopefully right more often than wrong, and it consists of multiple elements. Effective communication is about more than just the message. In fact, it's a combination of many diverse elements. And the last point I'd make is that, that communication is also a science. It's a science which continues to evolve. And that's, if you are planning on being a communication expert, then it's a science that you need to keep on top of and understand, what's proving effective and what new communication tools are out there. So sometimes perhaps not as simple or as intuitive as we'd like it to be. Okay, ignore that slide. Moving on to the next section, strategic communication. So I'm including this just to give you an idea of the different kinds of communication that you might find yourself called upon to do, or you might just find that you have to do as part of the jobs that you get. And there's a broad range of them. So I think I've worked on all of these at different stages in my career, but you have internal communications. So where you're communicating to employees and your colleagues. In a large company, this is about more than just email and talking around the water fountain, of course. You might need to create some kind of structured company-wide communication that goes out like a newsletter, or perhaps a briefing or a seminar or something like that. There's business to business, which could of course be like contacting potential suppliers, maybe retailers. This is a little bit distinct from marketing, which comes further down, which is communication with customers, which tends to be a bit more flashy. But it's still quite similar in the kind of activities that you will engage in. Then there's investor relations. I haven't done this one, where you're going to need to communicate with financial organizations. Quite often, these kind of communications are structured, they're regular, so they take place every few months or perhaps every year. And then the ones which I've highlighted in a sort of greeny gray down here is what I think most people think of as communications. Certainly what I like to spend my time on, and it's the public communications or public relations, where you're connecting with outside publics and people and trying to make your case or sell your product. And there you have media relations, so communicating with the press, public affairs, where you're trying to connect with opinion formers, quite often politicians or policymakers, to try and to get your point across. And then I've also included a very important one, of course, for nuclear, which is crisis management, which is what you need to do when it all goes wrong, how you communicate effectively to make sure that people are protected and doing what they need to protect themselves. Okay, communication is strategic when it's completely consistent with a corporation's or organization's mission, vision, and values, and is able to enhance the strategic positioning and competitiveness of the organization. Why am I saying this? Because it's what sort of distinguishes your social chit chat and even your information information messages from the messages which really can result in a positive benefit or outcome to what you're trying to achieve. And obviously, this is sort of structured for large corporations or organizations, but really, you can apply this to your everyday life, right? If you sit down and you work out, what it is that you really care about, what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then start thinking about your communications in those terms, I can tell you it will begin to have a profound impact on your success and how you're feeling and sort of how things start to go. So it's also something that, of course, you can continue to work on and sort of improve. I don't think any of us are born knowing exactly what we want to do. But for corporate communications, this is incredibly important. In fact, I would say that, if you don't know what your mission, vision, and values are, then you can't really communicate strategically, because you don't know what you're fundamentally trying to achieve and what the value of what you're saying or writing or doing really is. So it's important. There are or have been described sort of 4 basic models of public relations. The way it's described is that in the textbooks is that over time we have somehow become better, and we've developed like it's kind of proceeded in a linear fashion down to what is now best practice. But I personally think that in fact all of these models of public relations actually have their place in the right context, although usually, of course, we'll want to be using the best practice or what is recognized as best practice. So you have this idea of this press agent or publicity model, this idea where essentially people are just being blitzed with information that may or may not be true. Propaganda, essentially, is what's going on. And, they're using these techniques to try and get the audience to behave as the organization desires. Now, propaganda is a dirty word. We don't like to use it. There's obviously a lot of problems with this model. It's one-way communication. We're not listening to what the public or the stakeholders have to say. And of course, it's not particularly scientific or fact-driven, so there are problems there. Now, the next step up from that, or down on the chart, is the public information model of communication. And I can say that this is a model that I think that the World Nuclear Association especially very much focused on for a long time, and still does now to a large extent, in trying to provide factual and up-to-date information, and essentially trying to let people make up their own minds on nuclear energy. So I have a lot of time for this model, because I think it is important that people have access to quality information, but there are still some weaknesses with it, and it's still one way. And we now know through, for example, the theory of the information deficit model, that just because people get exposed to more information doesn't necessarily mean that they're then going to sort of embrace your cause and respond the way that you think they will. So that's really worth keeping in mind. Moving further down, there's the one-way asymmetrical model of communication, where you're using some kind of gosh, I've actually forgotten what this one is. I think you are using research really to find out what people care about. So you're doing market research, I think, and then you're still communicating to them. But importantly, to a certain extent, they're still not really kind of engaged in the process. And then right at the bottom, we have the sort of the stakeholder model, the two-way symmetric model, where you're negotiating with people. You're listening to them, actively listening, and then communicating your truth or your message to them, and adjusting it as need be, perhaps achieving a compromise, which of course is considered the gold star. But like I said, I think that in different situations, different models can be appropriate. So it's worth knowing all of them and knowing that really there are benefits and limitations to all of them as well. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit on how you develop a communication plan. This here is an example of a stakeholder mapping exercise that came about when the World Nuclear Association was in the early stage of developing its own communication plan. And what you want to do is to try and work out how important the stakeholders are to you. And this might be a combination of several factors. So 2 dimensions on this chart: the influence or the power of those stakeholders over you, and the interest that those stakeholders may have on the x-axis down there on what you have to, on what you're saying or your activities. And so the categories, for example, in the red here, are ones which are considered very important. And when it comes to prioritizing resources, they're where you want to spend your most time. Now, I want to emphasize this because I think that in communication planning, so often what goes wrong is the incorrect or inadequate identification of a stakeholder, right? And if you haven't got your stakeholders right, then, you know, when you structure your communications and you try and send them out, you got to end up mixed up, right? I mean, if you want to communicate to policymakers, but you, or maybe say the regulator, but you do something that's too simple and you put it on YouTube instead of sending it to them, it seems so obvious, but I can tell you that many times it just, you go astray. So identifying your stakeholders, working out what's the most important one to you, and remembering to prioritize your resources to those stakeholders is very important. So here's an example, right? Say you've identified that journalists are an important stakeholder that you wish to reach. You might want to work out what you're trying to achieve with them, the objective. So, you know, build support for nuclear projects. Then you sort of sit down and think about it and say, well, we need to come up with messages which we think are going to work with them. And this process can change. You know, it's not set in stone. The message, it's a dynamic world out there and things change. So the messages need to change. And then you need to consider the tools that you have to do it. For example, I mean, you might want to get some press monitoring software and a press contact database that allows you to make contact with a large number of journalists, or perhaps you would prefer to focus on social media and building up connections with a few journalists that you know personally. Both are valid and both are likely things you'll want to do. And just to realize that developing a communication plan is a fairly complex process. You have multiple stages to go through. And it's important to realize that it's dynamic. So once you finish, it doesn't just fall into a box and you sort of forget about it, but you need to revisit it periodically. When you are developing things like messages, you need to come back to them to change them to reflect the environment and the things which are changing in the world around you. So I would like to talk a little bit now about the media cycle and what it means. We're getting closer to talking about things which are of relevance to nuclear advocacy and communication now. So I think there's a bit of fear around the media that some of us have, and many of us still have it, even after having sort of worked in the field for a better part of 5 or 6 years. But it's good to understand what's actually taking place. So firstly, I mean, what happens when an event happens, when something newsworthy happens? I mean, how does it get reported? Well, usually there's a local journalist or somebody nearby. It might get put into a small country paper or something like that. And it's breaking news then. Then perhaps it's interesting enough that some larger media organizations discover it, and then they promote it as well. This all happens very quickly, by the way. And then this story can really escalate. It can make its way onto the front page. If it develops over a couple of days, then, you know, it could get a lot of attention, and it will reach a peak and stay in this period for a long time. And then what you will find is that it disappears. And I think this is really important to realize, because a lot of people, you know, they consider bad publicity or bad press to be a terrible thing. And of course it is, but also the news cycle moves on. People lose interest. Other stories crop up, and we're all surrounded by so much information now that scandals and things, when they occur, they're really just a sort of a flash in the pan. However, there is a long period after a story has kind of lost its public attention, during which opinion takes place, and you know, there's a lot of views which are shared, and it's often these opinion pieces, I think, which can be really damaging to a reputation. And it's also the opportunity, I think, where corporations and individuals have the most place to get involved, right? So you can't really change the news, not after it's happened, but you can engage with the opinion and the discussion that's taking place afterwards. So it's very important to engage with opinion that affects your organization. And when you look at what the media cycle really sort of resembles today, I mean, these are all models, obviously, they're not perfect, but the news cycle now is really, truly interactive. And what starts off as being sort of covered in newspaper articles and editorials and radio programs soon turns into Facebook discussions, you know, online meetings, blogs, WhatsApp groups, and emails. And sometimes what takes place in those Facebook and Twitter and the social media platforms will end up being reincorporated back into the news and into, you know, subsequent stories, which drive even more interest. So there has never been more potential to sort of to get involved in trying to shape opinion, and also more potential risk opinion pieces which are produced. So very important that you know, companies wake up to this, and I think most of them are. I hope they are in nuclear, and then increasingly they realize the importance of engaging with this and not just burying your head in the sand and hoping that the negative story or the bad publicity goes away. So social media, you know, can you just hop on Twitter, create an account, and expect the entire world to listen to you? Not so much anymore. No, times have changed. It's difficult, in becoming increasingly difficult for corporations to reach their interesting. Have I just switched to a new mode? Did that happen? Is everybody seeing my next slide, or is
It's been
that
like
just
that
me?
the entire time. Just continue.
Oh, I've just noticed. Okay, well, we can continue with it as is, or can we? Can I? Why is it switched
You're
to that? I
fine.
don't really know. Okay, I'm going to continue. Sorry. So the yeah, it's becoming increasingly difficult for corporations and organizations to reach their publics. So what you'll find is that instead there are some individuals who have become like increasingly kind of prominent, or places, you know, where people go to or turn to get their information. And these people are essentially influencers, although not all of them like to use that word. In fact, that's so if you want to try and communicate to a large public, then I think it's important that you know, you need to consider how you actually reach the influencers, or whether you can communicate with the influencers who are trying to engage with that public, especially given the long amount of time it takes to actually build up a brand presence on social media these days. Here's just one example of an influencer, a nuclear influencer, a self-professed nuclear influencer who I believe was born in Brazil, Isabel Boameke. If you haven't seen her stuff, I really encourage you to go and look at it. She's active on Twitter and TikTok. And for me personally, I think she's been one of the amazing breaths of fresh air that's come into nuclear communication. She's doing it all from her own desire and will, and has embraced a model of communication which I don't think industry can copy. So absolutely fantastic to see, and well done to her. So some key points. I think I've covered them in the talk, so I'm going to move on and allow people to come back to them because still a bit of material to cover. And I want to move on now to talk about nuclear communication. And I think that when we talk about nuclear communication, the first and most important thing to discuss is public opinion. What do people actually think about nuclear, right? That context, that all-important context which shapes our communications and what we should be saying. And this slide is a sort of an idea of what people actually think about nuclear now. But it is very interesting to show just how much perceptions of nuclear, public attitudes on nuclear vary around the world. And some countries tend to be immensely positive about the technology, while others are much less so. You know, so there's this kind of split with countries, but it also, of course, goes down to the personal level. So you might want to sort of think that, you know, just how well accepted is nuclear in your country? I mean, how much communication do you need to do about it if you're trying to convince people that nuclear energy is in fact a good idea? There are some well-known issues which are believed to negatively affect public. You know, there's the waste issue, which we'll hear again and again, especially on social media. And then, of course, there is nuclear accidents. That's a sort of a picture of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant you can see in the top right of screen there. And of course, there's the association with nuclear weapons, which many people still connect to nuclear energy for usually very lazy reasons, because they don't really understand the difference between them. So we're automatically kind of tarnished by the weapons brush. So what do we do about that? Right? How do we address these issues, or do in fact we need to address these issues to change public attitudes? Well, it seems that perhaps we need to do or think about those issues perhaps less than we have in the past focused on these issues, because risk perception is in fact quite a complicated process, and how humans perceive the world, it turns out, is often sort of dictated by certain shortcuts which we use, which take place in our mind, which we call cognitive biases. And these really determine a lot of our actions. So what's a cognitive bias, and how does it impact considerations of nuclear communication? Well, one of the most famous ones is this idea of social, where that if you put up a sign as, you know, please don't put your towel around, then a lot of people will still throw their towels onto the ground. But if you put up a sign on the wall and it says that 99% of people, you know, recycle their towels or hang up their towels, then you'll find that more people will in fact do that. So we're geared towards doing the thing which allows us to fit in with society. There are other ones too. So there's the, there's the idea of cognitive dissonance, I think, is a bias. I can't actually read my slides here. There's a whole bunch of them. Currently, none of them are, or not too many of them are coming to my mind. But what they all result in is that we use established shortcuts to work out what we're going to think about an issue and how we want to perceive it. So, you know, the most often one which we start to do is, well, we think, instead of like evaluating each claim sort of based on its information, we look at it in terms of the risk that it poses onto our social status, right? And so if we expect people to change their mind, but it damages their social status, then that is going to be a problem for us. And we need to try and communicate more smartly and not accidentally trigger these unhelpful biases. So what else do we know about the effects of nuclear communication? Well, we know that generally amongst the public, the risks and benefits of nuclear are generally not widely understood. We certainly know that the benefits are not so widely understood. We know that in general, when you communicate with people more and inform them about nuclear energy, then public acceptance levels tend to grow. And we see this in country after country, and especially, for example, it's something we see in locations around plants where the publics who are the most informed about nuclear, because they know people who work there, etc., tend to be much more supportive of nuclear energy than those who live further away. And so conversely, we see that when people feel less informed about nuclear energy, they're, I would say, more inclined to oppose it, but they're certainly, they're more inclined to not know how they feel about it. So it's definitely important that we do communicate and share information and facts about nuclear energy, definitely. We also know that there's this effect in nuclear public perception where most people believe that somebody else has a more negative opinion about nuclear than they do. And you can see this being particularly important for politicians who care very much about public attitudes. If they get the idea that nuclear energy is unpopular, then they are not going to want to support it. So that's a big potential problem. And, you know, working out how we can sort of dispel this myth, I think is very important. Research shows us, importantly, that safety messaging can backfire. And this is the sort of the caveat of the idea that we have to inform people more about nuclear energy, is that sometimes if we focus too much on certain issues at the wrong time, then we can actually end up having the result that they are more worried about nuclear energy than when they started off with. So that's the idea of backfire. It's something which we're all very aware of now. It's a question of how we communicate about safety, how often, and the kind of messages we put across there. So I won't go into it too much, but happy to take questions for anybody there. An important kind of sort of a follow-on is that if you are communicating about something which is about risks, to keep communication simple. You know, if you if people have a bad idea about nuclear safety and they don't understand it, and then you talk to them for half an hour and involve very complicated concepts that they don't understand, the chance that they're going to walk away from that thinking that nuclear is still unsafe. But if you give them like short, factual information that they can understand and they don't get confused by, then they're more likely to come to a better understanding. Okay, another good thing to do is to sort of is to carry out a SWOT analysis. Here's an example of one, but as Marco kind of pointed out, there's no magic sort of formula for communication, right? So the idea of a SWOT analysis is to work out what are your audience's sort of thoughts and feelings about nuclear, and what issues or what messages are likely to resonate with them and prove to be effective. Now, because everybody comes from different backgrounds or has different understandings, it's always going to be different. So it's important to do your research here. You might come to some surprising results. You might find, for example, that what concerns them most in the world is actually about economic opportunities, and therefore, perhaps your messaging around nuclear energy should talk about jobs, should talk about the socioeconomic benefits which are brought to society at large, instead of perhaps talking about safety, or perhaps instead of emphasizing climate change. Alternatively, you might find that they care about the environment very deeply, and you want to emphasize those messages more. But the important thing here is not just to go with what you think, but to really reach out and to see what the audience thinks as well. Another thing which has become a sort of key element of nuclear communication is that typically the industry attracts very fact-based and very individuals who do spend a lot of time reading textbooks and reading scientific articles on the internet. But a lot of the rest of the world is just not like that. And they're not necessarily as concerned with facts as we are. But one thing that they do care about a lot is the whether the person who's delivering the message and communicating to them is a person that they like and care about, and who shows principles of warmth and compassion themselves. So somebody that they can relate to. They say that people are more likely to forgive a mistake from somebody who is warm and compassionate than from somebody who is cold and distant. It's once again coming back to the non-message based elements of communication. We can't forget about those. What people think about us can be as important as what we're saying. Yep. So what else can we do? How can we sort of come to better messaging in nuclear? Well, here's an idea of what underpins public perceptions of nuclear energy in the UK. And it turns out that whilst people have preferences for different energy technologies, so of course we know that they love solar and wind usually, there are a bunch of factors which really influence those beliefs, and which presumably if another energy technology was to sort of absorb into their communication or to identify with. If they identified with these things, it could potentially change their perception of that energy technology. So this is for the UK. What is the sort of core values which affect their sort of preference for perceived preference for energy technologies? Well, you have the reduced use of energy. So energy efficiency is considered a core value, reducing the use of finite resources on the earth. So conserving the earth, avoiding waste, obviously availability and affordability, reliability and safety, autonomy and freedom. This is an interesting one, but the ability to sort of choose and to have a sense of control, probably over their energy providers, but also including over their own life, right? And then social justice, which I think increasingly now is being brought into nuclear communication activities, principles of fairness, honesty, and transparency. Are you a good corporate citizen or social member of society? Those kind of things. And then long-term trajectories, I think, including technology, this idea of the fourth industrial revolution, things always improving. These are the values we care about. So understand the identifies with this, but more importantly, you can also shift your own corporate culture to align with these values too. And I think that's very important because if you don't believe or actually practice this stuff, then you can't really communicate about it effectively. So it's not just a question of changing your communication, but also changing your culture to sort of identify these things for the stakeholders that you're trying to reach and who you are, the kind of people that you really are. Okay, I know we're moving out of time, so I'm going to speed up. Another important nuclear communication lesson, we need to identify the positives more than the negatives. It's not true in all situations, but especially for our active promotion material, we need to remember to lead with the positives. Because in the past, we simply haven't done that. We've thought that it was very important to, to constantly address the perceived fears and phobias that people had, but there was a chance that by doing that, we were really just reinforcing in many people the fact that these things were the phobias that we were trying to talk about. So, this weighting, the simple question of how much you talk about certain issues is really important. And, when we talk about, when we message about it, people to understand the beneficial, away from how people have seen it in the past, so waste and accidents, etc., and realize that this is a technology that is good for the climate, it's good for jobs, and it can help you to build up into a wonderful, educated, and scientific society. So we need to remember to talk about those things as well as addressing the negative issues. Okay, and of course, I can't really talk about nuclear communications without emphasizing the importance of building trust. And keeping that sort of central in just about everything that you do. So, I mean, what is trust? Well, I think the important aspect of trust is that when you're communicating things, you're not necessarily trying to change somebody's mind, but what you are trying to do is to make them realize that you are somebody that they can count and depend on. And that's somebody that they can count and depend on to provide them with accurate information. And from a nuclear operator's view, it's obviously somebody that they can trust and depend on to run a nuclear facility properly and not make mistakes or screw up. So trust takes a long time to earn, but it can be destroyed very quickly. As we see, for example, in the case of BP, when an accident happens, right? So, how we respond to accidents really determines who we are as an industry and who we are as individuals. So in the case of Tony Hayward, I mean, an accident had happened. It was very bad. How did he respond to it? Well, apparently he went on holiday, right? And you can imagine how people felt about things then. Well, it's like, well, here's an accident. It's out of control. And the boss of the company has just disappeared for a couple of days when everything has gone as bad as it possibly can. So at that stage, you can only expect people to react very negatively to you. So what do we do in the case of a crisis? Well, this is where Patricia really had direct information. I can only talk about my experience, but be the first to break the news. Say it yourself. Then you want to realize that during the accident phase itself, it's incredibly important that the people that you know, who can be affected are receiving the best information that they can as quickly as they can, so that they can respond to it, and that authorities can respond to it as well. You want to be caring and empathetic. You need to put your expert's hat on and get the best information that you can. I think it's incredibly important to realize that, you know, we talk about crisis communication around the event, but actually it's the relationships that you establish with the press and with other kinds of communication before an accident happens that will determine to a large extent how effective you are at managing your crisis and whether or not people will come to trust you again after it. And of course, good factual information. And I'm just going to proceed now to talk a little bit about some helpful nuclear communication resources that you can take advantage of. First off, you might be getting a copy, I'm not sure, but Talking Points was developed by the World Nuclear Association. I had a little bit of a hand in this one. It's really an information-based communication tool where it provides some messages, but importantly, some researched and supporting facts and references that you can use, corporations or individuals can use in their own communications. It can be helpful. It was originally sort of designed for press communication, but I think what we've seen is a lot of companies have also used it for other purposes too, not least of which being like staff induction, because it turns out that people starting off in the nuclear often have some strange ideas about it as well. And then there's the World Nuclear Association information library itself. A lot of information there, constantly updated by experts who ceaselessly work to make sure that it is as accurate as possible. It's one of the world's largest nuclear websites with information on just about any topic you can think of regarding nuclear, and always a good place to start your research. Here's a few more. A really excellent communication resource, which talks a lot more about cognitive biases, especially, which I kind of rushed over today, is the IAEA Nuclear Communicator Toolbox. I can't recommend it strongly enough. Get on, have a look at it, see what they say, and especially if you're trying to develop a nuclear communication plan, this is a fantastic place to start. So real hat tip to the IAEA there. And also do make sure to check out your local associations and technical societies. They will have communication resources which could be very specific to your own country and your own needs. So don't forget them at all. And of course, Sarah can talk about this, but there's going to be a network for nuclear innovation launched. I think it's launched already. The fact is that, you know, like when they come to build these reactors, they're going to face the same kind of the public questions and also the regulatory hurdles that existing reactors face. That, you know, what we sort of don't win the nuclear debate when people think it's great. What I think we really win the nuclear debate when people just become comfortable with it, when they stop worrying about it, right? So, you know, I would really sort of personally suggest to these advanced reactor designers that they look at safety really sort of as a hygiene factor, something that they need to do to get their regulatory approval and to be built in certain locations, perhaps closer to like industrial centers. But really what they still need to do is exactly the lesson which I talked about here, is that they need to emphasize the benefits, you know, what their technology can do, what is special about it, perhaps how it's different. And there should be more to that than just a safety message, I think, right? Because we know that it's not, at the end of the day, the only thing that people care about. People care about nuclear safety when there's an accident, right? Or when they're given reason to think about it, when it's brought to their attention. And if we keep bringing it to their attention, then they're going to keep thinking about it, and they're going to continue to associate that with nuclear. So what we want to do is, and what advanced reactor designers should be doing, is getting away from that, in my personal opinion.
Okay, thank you, David. Now we are calling our second guest, Mr. Jontahan Cobb. Yeah, Mr. Jontahan Cobb, in the first 10 years of his career, worked for BNFL at its Sellafield, Risley and London offices in R&D, Advanced Technology Evaluation, Communications and Corporate Strategy. He specialized in climate change and sustainable development, attending many of the UN climate conferences. Since joining World Nuclear Association in 2006, Jontahan has also focused on communications. He has represented the association on BBC News, Sky News, France 24, CGTN, TRT, and Al Jazeera. Dr. Cobb also organized the program for the World Nuclear Association Annual Symposium and is lead author for the World Nuclear Performance Report. Please be welcome, Mr. Jontahan. Mr. Cobb.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody who is watching this presentation. Really appreciate you taking the time to watch it. In it, I'm going to give some practical examples of press communications, some things that I've picked up over the time I've been involved in that activity. I'll start by sharing my screen. Hopefully I'll be sharing full screen, so if I'm not, please burn me in the chat and I'll fix it, but I think I should be okay. Here we go. So yes, I'm Dr. Jontahan Cobb, Senior Communication Manager at the World Nuclear Association. And in this presentation, I want to be addressing three main topics: press inquiries, how to respond to them; press releases, what are their purposes, what content should be in them, and how do you disseminate them; and press interviews, both written interviews, video interviews, radio interviews, which now I guess could also be considered to be podcast interviews. So first, to press inquiries. There are three types of inquiries I think you can characterize most inquiries as. These are requests for information, requests to reuse content, and requests for comment. If we look at the first question, requests for information, you may be in a function where you're asked to provide information to different groups, to the general public, to politicians, to schools. You probably also will be asked by journalists for facts and information. Now, you should want to be helpful, want to be transparent, but it is good as well to be aware of what is the purpose of the inquiry. Can you determine what the information is going to be used for? If you can, you may be able to, for example, think of additional information that the person asking the question doesn't know about that you could supply to them. Or if you know it's going to be used in a negative way, you may still want to be transparent, but you may frame your answer in a more cautious fashion. Now, you do need to note that answering inquiries takes time. And that time is a resource that you have, and it's a limited resource. So do you have the information to hand, or would you have to do a lot of research in order to be able to answer the question? Now, a way of dealing with that is to think, is this a contact, is this a press contact that I would want to have at a much higher level in the future? Is this answering this question and taking a little bit more time going to help me to build that contact? That could be a reason for putting even more effort into carrying out this examination and providing the information. Now, I think if you're asked some facts and opinion, it's also important to be aware of when that might transition into providing opinion. If you're providing facts, then somebody else answering the same question would provide the same response. If you were providing opinion, that's your own opinion, and somebody else might give a different view. And so at that point, you transition from just providing information to be giving an opinion, and that opinion will be seen as representing the opinion of the organization that you work for, whether that's an association or a company. So you do just have to be aware of when a request for information transitions into this position statement mode. So moving on to the next slide. Request to reuse content. This is quite simple. You may receive a request saying, can we reuse the chart that you have on your website? Can we reuse some of the text that you're going to have on your website? Now, if you have a content reuse policy, then regardless of who it is who asks for that information, you have to meet that minimum level of response. You've given that commitment. But on your website, or whatever other communication form you have that the request is asking to copy, you should be thinking whether you own all the content that they are asking to use. Now, in the example of the slide I have in this particular slide, the graphic I've taken from our performance report, we sourced the data for the performance report from the International Atomic Energy Agency, PRITS database. That is their data. We credit it on our slides. However, we can't be sure if somebody uses this slide and adapts it, maybe crops out our logo at the top, might crop out the source at the bottom. Are they going to give that attribution? It can be important. Also, would they respect a request not to distribute content further? We were asked by a newspaper some time ago to give database information on the location of nuclear reactors. We have location information for reactors in our reactor database, but they wanted a copy of the raw data. We provided that on the understanding it wasn't going to be shared, but they have a policy of making their data publicly available. So that data set became part of the public domain. Now that's not a problem particularly. The issue is that that data then has been continuing to be circulated for many years after it was released because it's not being updated. And so it is out of date. And that's out of date information that is being used a little bit widely. So that's a problem. So I think it is important to check when you're providing data to limit the data set to the people you're providing it to, saying they can comment on it, but not release large amounts of data generally. Finally, you may get a request for a comment rather than for facts and opinion. Now, getting a request from a journalist is good. They're coming to you seeking input, instead of often is the case for a press person or a media person trying actively to get your comments into newspapers or other forms of the media. But they will be coming asking their questions. That may not be necessarily the question that you are wanting to provide information on. For example, this on the left-hand side is a recent email I received from one journalist just asking for information on some of the speculation that had taken place in the press about Rolls-Royce, their proposed SMR, and the fact there were stories saying that the government was going to be providing funding. Now, ahead of an announcement, I didn't really want to speculate on whether or not that would take place. That wasn't our place to do. Also, it wasn't really helpful for me to speculate on whether, if that funding wasn't provided, whether that would be a big challenge. I don't know the situation for the organization. Certainly, they considered getting this funding to be important. That was in their public communications, but there may have been alternatives, such as partnering with another international organization. You know, the other things that I would not be aware of. So it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to speculate on a third party. Similarly, I was asked, how would this put Rolls-Royce in comparison to the global race for SMRs? The World Nuclear Association represents a very large number of organizations, including many that are in one way or another associated with producing SMRs. And it is not our position to start ranking one company above the other. So this is something where I'm being asked for information, but really it wasn't appropriate to directly answer the questions being asked. And it's quite all right to say that, if that is the case. I think one thing that will come forward as a message through this presentation is that when you get requests and questions put to you, you are not doing an exam. It is not your role to get as high a mark as possible by providing as much information as possible. You should be providing what is appropriate for you to do so. In this case, I can respond to that email with comments about the importance of SMRs, their role within a large portfolio of nuclear technologies, and that is comment and content that can be useful to the journalist. But it's being careful to understand what it is appropriate to be saying. So on now to press releases. Again, I think there are three types of press release that we can look at. One is where you're communicating on a key event happening elsewhere. Another type of press release where you might be wanting to promote your products or your services. And thirdly, as you're using the press release as a vehicle for your own announcements. So looking to communicating on key events. And what I mean by this is something taking place not under your control or the control of your organization that you want to provide a comment on. And an example of that is the recent IEA World Energy Outlook 2020. This is a report that gets a lot of press coverage. And in the IEA's output, they focus not particularly on nuclear, quite a lot on renewables, but they look at the whole energy suite. It is an important document, and we were looking to try to bring out some of the key nuclear points from this documentation. In our press release, we start off with a very brief description of what the document is, to put it in context. I'm not going to read through these paragraphs word by word. You'll be able to find them in the recent press releases on our website if you'd like. But I can say that the first paragraph simply puts in the context. The second paragraph extracts the key point about nuclear energy, the positive comment about nuclear energy that we found within this report. And then we put it into a broader context, because for the audience, they may not care particularly that nuclear is being put in a good light in this report. What they want to know is, what does it matter to them? And we say there that nuclear is essential for reaching climate goals, the Paris Agreement, air quality goals, and also that it's important for things like providing flexible generation, reliable generation, and jobs. So what we're trying to do is say, here's the report by a third party. Let us highlight the piece of information which is positive about nuclear, and let us tell you why that is good for you. And going on from that, in our press release, what we did was provide a key fact with some numbers, just to be able to put a factual comment into the press release, give it some context, not just opinion, but then also to provide comment from our then Director General, Agneta Riesing, giving her overview statement of why nuclear energy is important and what she is extracting from the IEA report that agrees that nuclear energy is important. And in fact, we continued the rest of this press release as a series of quotations from our Director General. And the reason for doing this is, when you're writing a comment on somebody else's publication or a key event happening elsewhere, what journalists often seem to be looking for is a reaction from an organization. If they're going to include third-party comment at all, they want to say, what did this organization say about that? So by putting our comments in the form of quotations, they can take any one of those quotations and say, Agneta Riesing, Director General of the World Nuclear Association, said, rather than having to make it an anonymous, the World Nuclear Association commented that. It provides a more direct communication and way of getting it to be more likely that your comment would be put into an article of this type. Now, in terms of trying to promote our own products or services, what a journalist won't want to do is provide a free advert for you. So what you can try to do is put things that you're doing, activities such as conferences or documents that you're issuing, into a context which they would want to report. So by making it news, by making it strategic. So we have the World Nuclear Supply Chain Report, Outlook 2040. This looks at the nuclear supply chain. It is a reference document. It isn't looking particularly to be providing strategic comment. It's providing a lot of data and information. Well, what we did in our press release to try to generate some interest and also to try to extract from the report something that could be good in terms of strategic communication was to take information about the scale of investment that there would be in the supply chain if there was a significant investment in nuclear energy, and say this is going to be a lot of information. And again, although this document wasn't looking to represent what are the positives about nuclear energy, in our second paragraph, in the quotation from Annette Riesing, we emphasize that this investment in the supply chain, this increase in the supply chain would be delivering more clean electricity, more jobs, and investing in local economies. So we're providing the benefits to people of nuclear energy as a way of introducing them to our nuclear report and hoping that they will then go to the report and perhaps investigate further. And another thing we did with the press release further down was take some key highlights. So in this very long document, which was around 200, 300 pages, there were some key facts which represented the very large amount of money projected to be invested in nuclear energy. We drew those facts out and put around 8 or 9 of them in the press release. So there could be an interesting point that could be put into an article that would be written about the report. We were drawing out those key messages for the author. Finally, with a press release, it is most likely that there'll be somewhere on your website, if you're making press releases, that you will list them. And in fact, this can be something you do in order to have material on your website that you may wish to make an announcement about. That wouldn't necessarily be something that you would expect for a news article to be written about. And in our case, we have had recently a change in Director General. Again, Riesing has retired from the association, and Sama Babali-Lyon has taken over as Director General. So we wrote the press release, not thinking it would get a lot of coverage necessarily, but it enabled us to put the press release onto our website. We could then link to it in our social media. It was a home for it to sit within the structure of our website. Plus, it is the case, if you send out press releases, there are robots out there that simply take the press release in its entirety and will copy it as part of the content of a repository of press releases. And that might be found by Google searches or similar. So it is very likely that somewhere a press release issued will appear on the internet and therefore can be searched and found. It's a way of providing content that will be delivered by search inquiries. So that's some of the simple things to do with press releases. But what about interviews? Here I'm going to cover interviews in various formats, which are basically text-based. I'll talk about interviews on the radio and also in podcasts, as though the main characteristic of many radio interviews is that they are live, and you need to react in the right way in a live environment. And then thirdly, I'll be talking about various forms of video interview and how they differ from the other two, how that visual element is important. So firstly, interviews for text. Now, ways in which you may provide material that will end up in a text report, some text media, whether web page or newspaper, is through a conversation. This, as I say, could be a news report, a magazine article, and it may start by getting an interview request on the telephone. That telephone call may come to your desk and you hadn't planned it. It wasn't something you agreed, but it comes through, and nevertheless, it could be a good opportunity to provide comment to get into an interview. It's important to note, though, if you're taking calls, and it is from a journalist or anyone else for that matter, unless you specify otherwise, you should consider that it will be taken to be an on-the-record comment. And furthermore, if you're identified as a press contact or the spokesperson for your organization, when you speak and answer the questions to such a spontaneous call, what you're doing is providing a view that can be taken as being representing the view of your association, not necessarily speaking in your own opinion or on your own behalf. You are a representative of your organization in a professional capacity. So be very clear that what you're saying is something that would be in line with what your organization would wish to say. Also be aware, and this kind of links to the first topic I talked about, you may start off with a call from a journalist who begins by asking for information, basic facts. How many reactors in the world? What is the latest model that's being developed in a particular country? But you may find that the questions start to move into that of opinion. If that happens, that's okay, but you need to be aware that the mode of the interview is changing from one where you're providing facts that don't necessarily need to be attributed to you, to one where you're supplying an opinion, which then does become something that is attributed and will be the view of your organization. So just be aware when a call is happening live, that may happen. Now, another way in which you may provide text is through a written interview. Often this can be something where you are supplied a number of questions, or you may be asked to write an article on a particular issue. Again, the same point comes. If you're given questions, you are not answering an exam. There is not a requirement for you to be answering each question as fully as you can. Think about what it is appropriate for you to respond. You should also be aware that you may be sent 10 questions and you provide a paragraph or more on each one. There is no guarantee that you will be quoted in full. In fact, you should consider that a single sentence may be taken from your response and put as a comment from you. And as long as it isn't misrepresenting you, if it's quoting an element of what you say, that can happen. So really, when you format your responses, you should consider, are you happy with every sentence that you write to be used in isolation? And if there's a sentence in there when you read it, you wouldn't be happy to have attributed to you without other content being included alongside it, you should perhaps reconsider your phrasing of that response. Also, one thing that can often be quite keen for people to ask for is, could we see a copy of your article, please, before you publish it, just to make sure the comments I've made have been, taken down correctly. I can check if there's any issues or errors. To be frank, often journalists making an inquiry will not want to provide this, particularly if they're working on a very tight timescale, when they're trying to write their report and get it published as soon as possible, or if they're getting views from many people and those views might be disagreeing. They don't want to have to start to arbitrate between the different people providing information. So you really shouldn't expect to have any pre-sight of the article you give an interview for, unless that is agreed beforehand, preferably in writing. So onto radio, and again, this can be any form of audio communication. Let's say you receive a request. It's from a radio station. They want to interview about a topic. What can you do? First of all, you can listen, because many radio stations have podcasts and repeat play available, to previous versions of the program you're going to be interviewed on. Try to find its format. Try to find out the kind of interviews they do. What's the tendency of the content? Also try to find out the format that you would be participating in. Is it expected to be a one-to-one interview with the hosts of the program, or are you going to be placed on a panel, possibly with people with a very different view to your own, anti-nuclear views? Can you ask as to what particular questions you're going to be asked, what topics? And you should ask yourself, is it the right decision to take part? Now, the journalist may not be able to provide you with the information I'm listing there. And one reason might be is if an event has happened and they are trying to put together an interview within just a few hours, they may be asking a large number of people at the same time, not got a response back. They're basically seeing who is willing to take part, and then they'll put together a panel or whatever format on that basis. So it isn't just them not willing to provide information. If you don't get these answers, they may not be able to. And again, if you're told this is going to be a 15-minute interview one-to-one, be prepared for changes. It may be because it's a live program, they have to change the timing. It may be made much shorter, much longer. A one-to-one interview becomes a debate with an opponent. Now, if the circumstances change, it's okay for you to think whether or not you want to continue. If it's changed enough that it is different, your agreement to take part doesn't need to be cast in stone. But you should think, having agreed to take part, what would be the impact of trying to not take part anymore? Probably you wouldn't be on the contact list the next time an opportunity came around, and you would be missing out on a potential opportunity in the future. So there is a balance here to be struck. When you finally get to do the interview, stay calm. Now, a familiar thing for me when talking to people ahead of an interview is that the journalist or their assistant will say, oh, do feel free to interrupt if you want to make a point. My advice would be, don't interrupt. Certainly don't be the first to interrupt, because what that does is often create an interesting interview, but the opponent or other person you're debating with then has the opportunity to point out that you've been rude, that you've interrupted, that you've not allowed them to speak, and it casts you into a bad light. So I would never take up that invitation to interrupt. Be aware also, if you have the interview and you suddenly find that the interviewer on a one-to-one basis is asking very difficult negative questions, they're playing the role potentially of a devil's advocate. They are putting the difficult questions to you and providing you with an opportunity to answer them. You shouldn't take it necessarily that the interviewer has negative opinions about the topic they're asking you. They're trying to just give you an opportunity to answer the questions that their audience would have. And that's an important thing to consider in which, whatever kind of radio interview you're doing, do remember who you are trying to get your message to. And it is primarily the people listening to the broadcast. This is not about trying to win a debate with somebody in a kind of school debate event. You're trying to get your messages across and create an impression and communicate both verbally and through all those non-literal ways that David was talking about to the audience. They should remain at the back of your mind, the focus of your activities. Do deliver key messages when you can, but be aware that if you have some statements that you often make, there are standard messages that you as an organization make. If you're in an interview with somebody that you're debating with, they may well be aware from listening to you before that these are the statements you're likely to make. And if they're clever, they would have prepared good rebuttals to those statements. So do try to keep things fresh, I think, in communications. Now, on the other side, if you hear an opponent saying something and you know they've made a mistake, you can respond if you've got a simple counterpoint. If they made a point and the only way to counter it is to be very technical, it's a very detailed piece of information for you to respond to. The problem is that you have to consider again your audience. You can't expect your audience to have the background information that you would have necessarily between yourself and your opponent. So you need to be able to counter it simply if you do want to do that. And also be aware, if you start talking about the point your opponent has made, you are then discussing what they consider to be important. And it may not give you the opportunity to talk about the things that you want to pass on in terms of your messages. Now finally on to video interviews. And I'm going to talk about 3 different forms of video interview. Interviews when you're in a TV studio and being interviewed on your own or potentially as a panel. Occasions when you're in a remote studio, appearing perhaps as a talking head on a screen as far as the broadcast is concerned. And finally, when you're talking over Zoom. Zoom has become prevalent over the last 6 to 8 months. It is going to be important into the future, and I think it's useful to be talking about that. So firstly, TV interviews. It is likely that you'll be asked to come to the TV studio long before the interview is due to take place, just so they're sure that you're there, so they can do things like fit microphones. Also, you probably will have the opportunity to meet other panelists. Now, be prepared for people in the debate itself to behave quite differently how they may interact with you before the interview. They're more likely to be friendly. They may be asking you questions. Be aware of what they might be doing. They might be trying to find out what you're going to say so they can preempt their responses. So there's a little bit of gamesmanship involved in these kinds of pre-event meetings with other panelists. If there's makeup, I would advise you to use it. In the bright studio lights, a little bit of foundation across the lip here stops that appearing shiny. If you've got, like me, a receding amount of hair, swallow your pride, put a little bit of powder over the bald parts here, because there'll be bright lights shining down and they'll turn your head into a lighthouse. So it is worth just putting a little bit of powder on, a little bit of foundation, just to stop that appearing. If you meet the presenter, or perhaps they have an assistant who works with them, try to help them. They want to have a good program. They don't want you to do badly, unless it's a real attack interview, which really doesn't happen that often. But they want to have a good program. They want to ask the right questions. If they ask about the topic, what you might consider is saying what the interesting questions are, as well as what you think the interesting answers are, because they are the ones who probably will have to ask the questions. So this might be taken up, it might not. They may have prepared their interviews straight off and not be interested, but it certainly gives them an idea of the kind of things that you would say, and they may be evaluating whether they think that's valuable, or it might give them a clue that there's a good point here that they should pick up on. So here's a slide of a regular studio TV interview. I'm on the right as we look at it there. This is on Sky News, and this was a general debate about climate change. And there's quite a mix of speakers there. On the left, the woman in the red cardigan is representing British industry in general. The gentleman in the pink shirt and tie was from Extinction Rebellion, the climate campaigning group. The person on the TV monitor was Bjorn Lomborg, who was suggesting that we put too much emphasis on action on climate compared to other problems in the world. That's the host in the black suit, and I'm there on the right-hand side in the blue suit. And I've described people by how they look, and that's a kind of unfortunate thing. We think that we shouldn't judge people by how they look, but we do. And you have to be aware of that. So choose your outfit wisely. In this example, I'm wearing a suit and a tie. I'm not wearing that today. This is an element of working from home. It would be a bit strange to be putting on a suit and tie when you're working from home. I've dressed a little bit more formally today, or normally wearing a t-shirt. But in this example, I went in with a suit and tie, and I could see that the host is wearing suit and tie as well. So it's not inappropriately formal. And also the host in many ways is the representative of the audience. So I'm matching his level of formality. If I got in and I saw that people either were wearing no suits or jackets at all, or weren't wearing ties, the easy thing about a tie is you can take it off, stick it in a pocket, it's out of the way. Again, in such an interview such as this, expect changes. If you've been told you're on a 15-minute interview one-to-one, you may end up on a panel for 5 minutes, or for, in this case, half an hour. Live with these changes if you're happy to do so. Recognize again who you're talking to. Now, in this visual format, you are in fact talking to the other presenters, because you are being seen by the audience to talking to the presenter, to talking to the other people on the panel. So you don't necessarily ignore them, but you need to be aware of them. But again, overall, you are not there to try to win a debate with any of the other people in the room, or to beat their point. You may have a point challenging what they say that you personally think is an absolute winner. But if they're not talking about what you're there to represent, the nuclear industry, you are using up time. Even if you make that point, you're not doing your job. The other thing to think about when you're in vision is to think of your listening face. You can try to remember to keep a fairly neutral face, when you're being interviewed. Some people, and I know I'm one of them, have a tendency to get a bit frowny when we're talking about difficult things. You should try to be quite neutral, not a magical smile, but something which is friendly and looks like you're taking things seriously, but you're not worried or concerned. That applies also when you listen to other people. If somebody says something you don't agree with, you don't know if you're on camera at that time or not. So you don't want to make some kind of angry gesture because you don't think you're on camera. You know, be respectful. At the same time, one common mistake made is to do the nodding and to do the smile, and you're looking like you're agreeing with somebody. And then suddenly they conclude their statement by saying, and that's why we shouldn't invest in nuclear energy. And what you've done then is give a visual signal to people that you agree with their anti-nuclear statement. So neutrality, listen attentively, is what I would advise in these cases. When you're on the interview, again, be calm, but don't be bland. Don't go, nuclear energy is a way in which we can save the planet by cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and that's very important. I mean, this is a good message, so you should say it in a way which communicates that it means something. Nuclear energy is an excellent way of cutting greenhouse gases, and that's a way in which we can save the planet. Something a bit more natural and human, I think, works well. Regulate the speed of your speech. I hope that I'm speaking at a reasonable pace in this presentation. I'm aware that it's being translated, and that's a reason to go a little bit slower. I hope the translator is happy with my pace. In the studio, if you're excited because you're on TV and this may be new to you, or you're excited by the debate, the natural tendency is going to be to speed up and speak as fast as you can. Don't. Try to measure yourself. Again, don't interrupt first. If the debate becomes uncontrolled, and you want to get a message across, you may have to interrupt a little, but try not to be the one who's seen as being the one being rude to start with. Practice your sound bites, again, the key messages you want to get across, but if you're going to say them in a way that it sounds like you're saying them for the first time. The trouble is if you say nuclear energy is a clean and reliable form of electricity generation, you've may said that again and again and again. So when you say it, you're bored of it. I mean, bored of saying it, I should say. That's not what people want to see in the interview. That won't be convincing in the interview. So try to say everything as you're saying it for the first time. Be aware of the live situation. Be aware in a panel that it may be that the topic is going to move on to what other guests are able to talk about. So do get your key messages in early, in the first response, to make sure you deliver them. But don't just rehearse 3 points, say them all in the first response, and then struggle to think of what to say if you're asked for another comment. And think again what you're willing to say. If you've given your prepared responses and you're asked something, do you want to respond to that question? In a live environment, it's difficult, but you want to give the impression that you're an expert, but you shouldn't say what you're not meant to say. A little distraction here. This is a remote studio interview. You appear on screen, in this case, as somebody who's standing just in front of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Remote studios are often rough. They are tiny rooms. There's a remote camera. There's not even somebody behind it. You're in on your own. You have an earpiece in your ear, and that's all you can hear of the program. You don't see the interviewer. You don't see yourself on screen. So you need to focus in that situation on thinking that you're on TV standing behind the Golden Gate Bridge and appear to the audience as if that's the case. Don't cock your ear to listen like that because it's a little difficult to hear. Present yourself visually because you could be on the screen. Always assume that you are on camera. If you're sat 10 minutes before the start of the program is due to start, assume from that point you may be broadcast. Because what might happen is that before the commercial break, they will run a trailer saying, and we're going over to John Smith, who will be talking about this important nuclear issue. And if you're at that moment in time laughing or gesticulating or picking your nose or brushing your hair, that will then go put on the screen. So, you know, put yourself into interview mode, neutral phase, look at the camera. If an assistant comes in to talk to you, you might actually want to give the reply still looking at the camera. When you're in the interview, don't assume that you're on camera if you can't see yourself. They may have cut to a VT of some video to illustrate the thing that you're talking about, or some general stock footage. So it's no point saying, and there's a fuel pellet, and the fuel pellet is about that big, because people won't be able to see your hands. So try to say everything as if you're off screen, unless it is clear that you're not. Finally, don't be distracted. If there is a technical problem, if an engineer comes in and they start messing with the cables because the audio is a bit iffy, don't refer to it into the interview. You might be fine, and you should carry on as if things are okay. If there's a problem with the audio, if there's a problem with the video, it's up to the interviewer to tell their audience that is the case. And finally, on to Zoom. Everybody now has a TV studio because of fast internet and the way in which video communication has come forward. Plus, because organizations, broadcast organizations have had to rely on Zoom, the deficiencies there are in Zoom have become more acceptable. Nevertheless, we should try to make things look good. It is likely that this form of communicating will become prevalent rather than being asked to go to a remote studio. I was already being asked to do Skype video calls long before we went into the pandemic situation. So for those of you who are doing such interviews at work, you should try to get a good work location, somewhere that sounds good, somewhere with a good background, somewhere with good lighting. Here in this home location where I am at the moment, I have my laptop precariously balanced on some books, tilted so that the screen is perpendicular to the wall. So if you look at the lines of the wall behind me, they should appear upright. In the image you can see on the slide here, our Director General, Agneta Riesing, you can see the lines of the wall sloping back. And that's because she had her laptop lower down, lower than her. She was looking down, it was leaning up. It brings in the walls like that. It doesn't look as good as it could. Also, when you're leaning forward and you're over 25, your skin starts to hang off your face and you look older and tired. So it is better if you are looking upwards. Also at home, you're unlikely to have studio lighting. I have a little ring light just behind the screen here that's providing some light in this direction. Because if I had lights just from the top, I'd have great big shadows and bags under my eyes. I don't know if you spotted the deliberate mistake in my background. I've tried to have a neutral background, but over my right shoulder on your left, there's a collection of whiskey. Now, some of you might be looking at that quite longingly, but there will be those who think that it is wrong to have alcohol and may object to it for personal or for societal reasons. Also, just ask the question, if you're trying to comment on something serious, do you want to give the impression that you're a heavy drinker by having drinks behind you? So when I do media and broader interviews, I get rid of that and put a collection of intelligent books behind me instead. It is worth making small investments to get a little bit of professionalism. Raise your laptop up so the camera is at eye level, so you're looking directly at it. When you're doing the interview, as much as possible, try to look into the camera, not at your slides if you can avoid it. And also try not to look at yourself if it's a Zoom call and you can see yourself. It's very tempting sometimes. You can invest in more serious things, a more professional web camera, or even a microphone. Audio is actually one of the things that is worse in a Zoom call compared to a studio situation. Video can be quite good. However, a good microphone can be quite expensive, so that's something that needs to be considered. Another thing you may be involved in is a Zoom panel. Much the same applies as to the individual Zoom interview. Try to raise your laptop so you're speaking eye level, and try to have it so that you're looking into the camera. The gentleman in the center of the interview here had two screens. He had his camera over to the side, and he was watching the presentations immediately in front of him. So when he spoke, he delivered to the side. Now that can work in interview situations where you see two people on screen and they appear to be talking to each other, but it did make it look like he was ignoring us when he was giving that presentation. Be aware also of using virtual backgrounds. They can be good, but they can also make bits of your face, your hands disappear. The separation between you and the background behind you isn't necessarily perfect. So they may cover a very bad background behind you, but I think if you can set up a real background, that can often be preferable. Also, when you are in a Zoom call, as much as possible, be seen as watching the event in case they have the gallery view like this. You should be expected to watch what is going on because you expect your audience to watch what's going on. Don't mute, answer some emails, talk to a colleague, have a coffee delivered, that kind of thing. So to sum up, here are 3 main points that I think apply to all the different types of communication I mentioned. Be clear as to your objectives for any press engagement. You're not doing it just to take part, just to carry out the exercise. Be aware that any section of what you say, whether that's a sentence in a written response, or one paragraph or one phrase that you give in a video call that could be 10 minutes long, could be taken out and used in isolation. So you should be happy with each element of your communication. And finally, when you're involved in press interviews, remember your audience, remember who it is you're actually trying to communicate with. With that, I'll conclude. I hope there are some questions to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was very interesting. Okay, and we have 15 minutes to do our QA session, but we have one question here. I particularly want to hear the both opinion of you about this. It's a question from Mr. Carlos Leitner. He asks, should the industry strategy be focused on training engineers and technical people to be better communicators, or to train communication specialists to be more familiar with the technical issues?
That's a very good question, and I think
I want to hear
I could take the
you both.
Run out. Yeah, I could take the coward's way out and say we should do both, and I think actually that is the case. You can imagine situations where perhaps if there's plant being developed, there's new plant being built, or if there's a situation at a plant which has been covered in the media, whether an actual emergency or not, it gives a lot of credibility if you can have somebody who is an actual technical expert, somebody who actually is working on the plant, trained in a way that they are able to give communications in the media. I think that provides a lot of credibility to do that. On the other hand, when it comes to maybe strategic issues or issues which aren't directly related to the day-to-day working of the nuclear industry, when you are talking about things like sustainable development, climate change, economic recovery, then clearly there is a role for somebody who is trained as a communicator. I think they also need an expertise in those subjects. So it's not that they are just, number one, a good communicator. It is also that they know about the topic and communicate about it. So, for example, I am not a trained communicator. My background is in working at Sellafield R&D. I'm a chemistry doctorate by training, and I've moved into communicating as one of the things I do. So I think it was also very obvious when you just have a professional spokesperson unable to answer the kind of questions and provide the detail that is wanted. So my leaning would be, because we are a technical organization and we deal with a technical subject, it is vital that whoever is talking does have the right level of technical knowledge, and then to be a good communicator. So if I have to pick one, get somebody who's a technical expert first, and if they have an interest in moving into media, provide them then with the training to become a good communicator about what they do.
I would back Jonathan up there. I think I said as much in the chat box. I'm very glad to see Jonathan saying almost exactly the same thing. So I guess I'd really just add that I mean, communication is changing. I mean, sort of obviously. So where before it might have been easier to put things and to put people into boxes, right? This one's a communicator, this person's not a communicator. Well, we're in a world now where everybody has a social media account. You know, we're in a world now where everything is increasingly being videotaped, and or you know, an employee could, for example, make a mistake in an email and send it out broadly. So you know what's contained sort of in that message or what they're doing. So having an up-to-date and basic awareness of communication is really important for everybody. And you know, we can't get away from that, and we just can't deny the changing realities of how communication is taking place. You know, so people have these individual channels, social media accounts, which they can communicate from, and they're just going to be increasingly important going forward. There's going to be more communication, digital communication options, and people are going to have a voice whether we want them to or not. So we really do need to train people all across the organization. And the second point, I think, is that, yeah, I mean, what Jonathan was saying about finding the good technical communicators. I mean, we like to try and badge people as communicators and some as not. And sometimes we treat departments as communication departments and others as somehow not doing communication. But in fact, we're all we're all communicating. What we all find is that even amongst the technical people, there will be some individuals who have a real gift for communication, right? I mean, you probably follow a lot of them on social media now. They're immensely talented natural communicators. So why not identify these people and you know, build them up, support them with the resources and the training necessary, and let them do your cause or your company good.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, Jonathan. I want to know your opinion about how we can manage the perception of the people when we are talking about the benefits of nuclear. We are not against other sources of energy, yes, like renewables or fossil fuels, yeah. Particularly, my experience here, anti-nuclear people has a question of faith with the anti-nuclear topics, yeah. But how we can manage this? We are not against other sources, but we have a space, a room for nuclear in the grid of energy.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think it's one that is very difficult because often you'll be put in a situation where you are trying to demonstrate that your particular form of energy, nuclear energy, is the right choice, where it isn't a zero-sum game, where it isn't that choosing or not choosing nuclear has no impact on any other fuel source. So you are often trying to say why nuclear is good. And when you do that and compare yourself to other forms of electricity generation, of energy supply, naturally what you do is point out those other forms of generation and their faults or their deficiencies. So you might talk about the intermittency of some renewables like wind or solar. It may be that you quite strongly have an opinion that you are against fossil fuels in principle because of the impact of climate change. You may have gone into working on nuclear energy because you think it's vital to support zero carbon energy of all forms, and that nuclear is vital within that. So again, that is something which, particularly for a global organization, is very key because the energy situation is different around the world, and you do have to recognize that other people have other opinions. And if you're trying to influence their opinion and be persuasive to them, you have to recognize their position. If you come up with a very strong climate change message and you're giving that to somebody who doesn't believe in climate change, or they're reliant on their employment in the coal industry, then it's going to make it harder to put nuclear energy alongside that. Just by saying nuclear, low carbon, we must act climate change, renewables bad. Everything you do that isn't talking about nuclear energy, you are losing some of your audience if there are a diversity of opinion on those different topics. So it's very difficult. I think there's a balance to be struck between acknowledging that nuclear probably cannot do it all, and therefore other forms of energy are going to be needed, and then appearing to be so keen about other forms of energy that you might like as well, that it actually reduces the necessity of nuclear energy if that is the thing that you're trying to communicate.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, sure. So I would, 100% back up what Jonathan has said there. It is proven, I think, for us, it's fair to say, at the World Nuclear Association, to be difficult to build relationships with the renewables community, right? They're in our camp, we're in ours. You know, we have common issues that you think we could agree on, but we still don't always sort of talk to each other that much. And, you know, when we wonder what we can do, there are some obvious ones, I think, some very low hanging fruit, as well as, harder questions we have to ask ourselves. But the simple stuff is that managers and high level senior people inside the nuclear community, they need to stop saying anti-renewables things if they want the renewables community to start talking to them and to like them. And there is unfortunately this line when you're talking, you know, you're making your case for nuclear or against other technologies where you can go too far or say something that's just blatantly afactual. It's not really on the level, right? And that community gets upset about that, and it just makes it harder to build relations there. More generally, we need to understand that perceptions around renewables and energy in general are impacted by deeper values, which I sort of indicated in the talk, right? And I think that, if we can identify ourselves and our industry more strongly with these values, or hopefully we do identify with them, but bring out these aspects, then we should be able to really cement relationships with the renewables community. So if their primary driver is climate change, or if it's about people care about renewables because they care about nature and natural things, then as much as possible we should try to identify those values which we share. So perhaps we could talk about the conservation projects in and around nuclear facilities, for example, and then maybe we'd start to find that we have common ground. But those are the two things. Don't talk smack about renewables, and try to identify the common values. And then I think we can sort of build alliances that last going into the future. Sorry, I can't hear you, Michael.
Sorry. Thank you, David. Our time is running out, but we have one more question. That's so interesting. Yes. In case if new waste repository, which country or organization would be a benchmark on public communication?
Jonathan?
Taking first go again, David. I think we have to look at some of the leading efforts on this have been done in Sweden. One of the most important things they've done is to engage in a two-way conversation. All those things that David was saying, two-way conversation about waste repository with the local communities that would be hosting them if it was agreed. They weren't just telling them it was going to be good for them. They were finding out what it was that they wanted to, what were the true concerns of those communities? What was it that those communities would think they would benefit from by hosting this? So definitely Sweden and Finland have done some pioneering work here in stakeholder engagement, and that is why those two projects are amongst the first to progress around the world.
So for the third time, I'm just going to completely agree with Jonathan there. I don't really know if there's much more to say. Where countries have gone pathway, it's usually been a hard slog and it's evoked a lot of opposition, but where they've gone down the pathway of consulting and engaging and trying to actively sort of build that local support, then it seems that outcomes have been better and more helpful, and that we should see some projects coming to fruition in the future, notably in Finland and Sweden. I guess the other thing to look at is that I mean, it's not it's probably too long to go into here, especially now, but I think the discussion around recycling is really important. And that we're living in I think globally it's true to say that there's this increasing emphasis on the circular economy, and that maybe it would be easier if we sort of tapped into some of the discussion around that when it came to sort of finalizing a waste repository. So that's a general comment. It's not really about countries. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm afraid we have run out of time. So before we finish, I would like to thank once more David, Jonathan, and thank everybody in the audience. I thought it was a very interesting experience, and the contents that you share with us will be very useful for the attendance and for us in the future. So that will be all for the session. I wish all everyone a nice day, and thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thanks very much.